I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily. The former Deputy Cabinet Secretary Helen McNamara said that he had nuclear levels of confidence, albeit utterly misplaced. Patrick Vallance, the former Chief Scientific Advisor, said that he had a habit of saying things that were untrue. Dominic Cummings, the former Downing Street Chief of Staff and Barnard Castle aficionado, said that he was a proven liar and in a cabinet of pigs. The man we're talking about is, of course, Matt Hancock. He has been up in front of the COVID inquiry today. I apologise in advance if there is an awful lot of rustling, because there was an awful lot of information that came out. To pick over it with me, our political editor, Beth Rigby.
I think you're going to have to scrap all of that intro, Neil, with all that swearing. You picked the spiciest descriptions by Dominic Cummings of Matt Hancock, which I think reflects quite well the little love lost between this pair.
We certainly will, and thank goodness for the bleep button. But let's start with, let's start where Hugo Keith Casey, the council inquiry, began today. And it was with the level of preparedness that there was in government. What were we hearing from Matt Hancock?
I think the thing with this, Neil, is if we think about what we're hearing about Matt Hancock is a continuation of the past couple of years where he sought to defend his record on COVID, and it began with being on I'm a Celebrity and trying to put his version of events ahead. And then it went on with his pandemic diaries, putting out his first draft of history before the official inquiry. And what we heard today from Matt Hancock in terms of preparedness is in basic contradiction to pretty much every single piece of testimony we've heard to date, in which he argues that there was a level of preparedness, that he saw it coming when others didn't, that he was trying to wake up Whitehall, and that just hasn't been borne out by what other people have said.
Why don't we have a quick listen to some of the exchanges that took place, the two voices you will be hearing, one perhaps more familiar, Matt Hancock, the former Health Secretary from before and for large chunks of the COVID inquiry, and Hugo Keith, the counsel for the inquiry itself.
At the start of the pandemic, the department, including me, was trying to wake up Whitehall to this threat. And early on, the department ended up doing things which really aren't for a health department. But we were doing them because nobody else was.
Could you just give us one or two examples?
I'll give you one example. Shielding the Vulnerable is a programme that eventually was run very, very well by Chris Townsend, who was brought in from outside, and MHCLG departmentally. It was about how to get groceries to people, how to make sure that people got support, including from volunteers, how to make sure we looked after those who were the most vulnerable. That is clearly a cross-government effort and rightly led from a department that isn't the health department. But it was, I had to commission the work to get that going from the health department. Similarly, the view over whether or not to close schools ended up, and the NPIs ended up within the health department early on. Now that was taken back to the CTF, back into the Cabinet Office, and rightly so. So the department, yes, had a huge amount to do, but I would argue that because the rest of Whitehall was slow getting going, we had to get up there and do it. And if that led to criticisms from those in the centre of government, then, frankly, I'd far rather that we did step up and take that responsibility, even though it brought us flack later and evidently flack at the time that I wasn't aware of, because these issues were never raised with me personally.
If you were listening to Matt Hancock's evidence today in a vacuum, you would have the impression of DHSC riding to the rescue, that they were doing all of the work, that this should have been done on a cross-government basis, but it wasn't. We were the only people who were getting the groundwork done ahead of what we could see coming.
What's interesting with the Hancock testimony, it doesn't surprise me, is that he has sort of pitted himself as the kind of man who almost single-handedly, with his health department officials, was kind of trying to fight the machine and the toxic culture of Number 10 and the inertia of the Cabinet Office. And it was he and his colleagues within the Department of Health that saw it all and was pushing water up the hill, if you like.
I mean, he used the phrase, didn't he? I was the one driving the process.
Trying to wake up Whitehall. And the issue about it, and I think we'll come back to it, is it's just not borne out by the other evidence, right? If we step back and say, what were we going to expect from Matt Hancock? everything he said today is exactly what I expected from Matt Hancock today. As I've sort of said I'm sort of writing the script for the VT, the VT, that's such telly language, and we're on a podcast. I mean, double strikeout Rigby, right? In the report we're doing tonight, I kind of said in it, I wasn't expecting self-reflection, I was expecting self-protection, and that's exactly what we're getting, right?
The criticism, as I understand it, was that there wasn't a plan, that there certainly wasn't anything effective in place, that the Department for Health and Social Care were all at sea in the early stages of this, and that the only plan that there was herd immunity.
Yeah, so one of the central charges against Matt Hancock and his department was, where was the plan? And, you know, you could say that went to the Cabinet Office as well. It's not necessarily the Department of Health. But what Helen McNamara, the former Deputy Cabinet Secretary, effectively the second most senior civil servant in government, said quite clearly in her testimony, which you referenced, Neil, at the beginning, was that there was this nuclear level of overconfidence from Matt Hancock about how prepared the government was to deal with the pandemic that simply wasn't borne out by the evidence. And there was this kind of awful moment in Number 10 in early March where she walked into the cabinet room or wherever the Johnson was saying, and she basically said, we are, swear
effed,
word,
yeah.
we're effed. Like there's no plan. And in the testimony we heard from, be it Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Officer, Helen McNamara, or indeed Dominic Cummings, was a health secretary that was overpromising or saying things with confidence that was then not borne out. And this seems to be a sort of systemic problem that a number of people have said of him, and then I guess his job today is to try and answer those charges, right? If you're Matt Hancock and you're going into this inquiry, you have to find some areas where you might accept some culpability. If you're trying to defend your record, you know, you might have to go, yeah, I got something wrong. And what does he alight on as his biggest, quote, single regret, his biggest personal regret, and all of the things that went wrong during COVID that ministers or officials might have regretted. It was uncharted territory. It was a global pandemic. They didn't know what they was handling. I mean, there's loads of reasons why things went wrong, and they were not going to get everything perfectly right. And this is part of this inquiry to work out what went wrong and how it can be improved for next time. But the single thing he alights on is, I didn't override the scientific advice about asymptomatic transition. Anecdotally, I saw it. It's a bit like in a job interview when someone says, what's your greatest weakness? And you go, well, I'm a perfectionist. Do you know what I mean? It's
just a wee bit.
The point I'm trying to make is that his biggest regret is not overriding the scientific advice he was given, when actually, if you're the health secretary, I mean, the whole point through the whole pandemic was the debate, wasn't it, about should ministers override the science?
That's
because
exactly
actually
it.
the scientists knew a lot more than the ministers. So it's not really even a criticism of himself.
No, true. And even the scientists said, look, we are there to provide scientific advice. It doesn't mean that you have to follow exactly what we are saying, because, of course, there are public policy consequences from that. But I suppose that also goes
to the care homes, right?
Exactly.
And that's why this is kind of get your defence in early, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Because for me, and we haven't heard this testimony, but I remember covering it, Neil, and I remember all those press conferences, and I remember him saying that there was a ring of steel around care homes, and then we found out that people that hadn't been tested were being discharged from hospital and put into care homes.
And this was, again, relating to his mistaken belief that people who were asymptomatic could not be tested. I do want to move us on, though, because there was an awful lot of reflection on the personality clashes that were taking place in government. And we know, having us been there on the front line of reporting this through the early days of COVID, that there was a degree of dysfunction in government because of these personality clashes. What did you make of the point where counsel for the inquiry puts to him, look, all these people calling you a liar. Why do you think that was? Matt Hancock's response, but perhaps it was because I was driving the system so hard.
He basically says as well, not just I was driving the system so hard, he basically says, I just know it's not true. And if you look at what my officials in my department said, they would say it wasn't true, i.e. he goes back to this them versus us, which is a theme of the whole testimony that he gives. But also, what else can he say? I mean, unless he says...
Do you know what? Yeah, you caught me out there, Hugo. I'm a terrible liar.
I'm a terrible liar. I said all these things and I overpromised. What we're seeing in this evidence is that he is trying to turn it into it's me and my lot versus them. And he's bunched in Vallance and Sedwell and the former cabinet secretary, the former top civil servant, and Helen McNamara, the deputy, and Dominic Cummings. He's bunched them all in together, which in itself is interesting because actually Cummings was quite critical of Helen McNamara at times as well. So I wouldn't say that they are a kind of blob versus Matt Hancock. What I would say is that when you look at the evidence, there are multiple people who are working in government at the time who have similar levels of criticism of Matt Hancock, which is he overpromised and he didn't follow through. I mean, Sedwell said, I used to have to go and check things because he promised something and I had to make sure it was backed up. So Matt Hancock doesn't want to accept this claim. But, if you've got testimony from a number of other agents in all of this saying that you spoke mistruths or you overpromised, there's nothing in what he said today that has made me think that their testimony somehow was untrue in itself.
I mean, and that is in part why Dominic Cummings, has stated explicitly that he thought Matt Hancock was unfit for the job.
Yeah.
But of course, we were hearing from Matt Hancock today, and
yes.
He wasn't keen. I have to say, he wasn't keen to name specific individuals and criticise them directly. With this one big, massive exception at the heart of government, that Dominic Cummings was a malign influence, that he had an unhealthy amount of influence on decisions taken by the Prime Minister. Indeed, I have a quote from Matt Hancock here saying that Dominic Cummings said that decisions need not go as far as the Prime Minister.
The psychodrama between Cummings and Hancock kind of really blew open, didn't it, when Dominic Cummings gave evidence to Select Committee. I think it might have been in 2021, Neil. I can't remember the actual date. And he, at that point, totally hung Hancock out to dry. And it's been going on like that, and this personal animosity between the two of them. But, where Matt Hancock has a point is other people spoke of the toxic culture created by Dominic Cummings. In number 10, Helen McNamara herself talked about this toxic masculinity.
The Chancellor resigning, according to Matt Hancock, because of Dominic Cummings, the fear, in fact, that he explicitly referenced, inculcated by Cummings.
But you see, if you've got these two actors within this whole COVID inquiry where they're these personalities and it's framed as they're kind of at each other, be that Hancock and Cummings, I guess what you have to do if you're like reporting on it or if you're watching it is you kind of almost have to take them out of the picture and kind of try and work on what the more neutrals are saying to build a picture. But I mean, look, all this has done today is reinforce this sense of this deep dysfunction in government. And regardless of who said what or the rights and wrongs, what it speaks to is at the time where there was a giant pandemic and people were dying and hospitals were at risk of being overwhelmed, we had at the heart of our government people that were actually working against each other and maybe not the right characters in the right jobs. And that is, if you're one of the families standing outside because you lost a loved one, it must be so painful and frustrating and upsetting.
I suspect that is the point that many people will be taking away from today, that there was this clash between people at a point when there were predictions that the death toll could rise as high as 500,000. That will stick in a lot of people's craw. Beth, you take a deep breath. Listeners, we'll be back in a second when we will be discussing lockdown, Matt Hancock's influence on when that was instituted. Back in a moment. Welcome back. We are still in the Westminster studio following events at the COVID inquiry. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, is still here. And as mentioned, we're going to move on to the topic of lockdown because this is going to be the one that runs and runs, I think. As mentioned before, the criticism of Matt Hancock was that he was plan A, by which we mean herd immunity. We have been hearing from him today that he was pushing for lockdown. In fact, more than that, with hindsight, he accepts that lockdown should have happened far earlier. Tens of thousands of lives could have been saved as a result. But actually, at the time, he was calling for lockdown as early as March the 13th in a phone call to the Prime Minister.
OK, so this, you are quite right, I think, is in the terms of the inquiry, this is the thing that has really come to the fore, just about the chaos in Number 10 around the decision to lock down and really the kind of what was going on between January to March. And what's happened today is that Hancock has presented this new version of events in which he apparently, as you said, Neil, warned the Prime Minister on March the 13th, 10 days before the lockdown was announced, that we needed to lock down there and then. Dominic Cummings immediately put a tweet out saying that that is an outright lie. And he said that Hancock was flat out lying, that Hancock had been pushing for herd immunity and not for lockdown, not for Plan B. Right?
Past the 13th of March.
And what's interesting in this testimony of Hancock is this is the first we've heard of it, in that he didn't write this in his pandemic diaries.
It's not. Oh, heaven forfend! How could he have missed out that detail?
He just forgot this sort of minor detail in his It's not in. And actually, don't listen to me. The inquiry barrister Hugo Keith questioned this claim because he said the entry's not in the book, and there is let's just take this in. There's no written evidence in the thousands of pieces of documentation. I mean, don't put anything on WhatsApp that you don't want in the public domain, basically.
Let's have a quick listen to that particular exchange.
In my public communications, you will know that I had at that point been explaining that we might have to do that, yes. But I'm also a team player, and the government position was not yet. So this was a message about how to best explain the government position of not yet. But as I say, the position of not yet was running to the end of its road, and it was on the very next day that I first told the Prime Minister that I thought that we needed to lock down.
Was that the 13th of March?
Correct.
It's not in your diary, so-called, I should say, Mr Hancock. The entry for the 13th of March makes no reference to you telling the Prime Minister this vital piece of information that he should lock down immediately. Forgive me. Your book says the account that follows has been meticulously pieced together from my formal papers, notes, voice memos, my communications, WhatsApps, we know from the press, and it records in 555 pages all the relevant, important events as you saw it concerning the coronavirus response. But there is no reference to you telling the Prime Minister to call for an immediate lockdown on the 13th of March. And you know that there are no notes and no emails in the inquiry's possession, because we've given them to you, that records that conversation. So I am required to ask you, how sure are you that you told the Prime Minister that he had to call for an immediate lockdown in a call on the 13th of March?
I can remember it, and it came to light in looking forward to this inquiry. And what's more, the corroborating evidence, if you like, is that it happened. Is that it is recorded that on the 14th, which was the Saturday, there was a significant discussions in Number 10, at which I made this case again.
It is almost unbelievable, but I am placing emphasis on almost.
Well, look, the thing is that in all the documentation, there's no written evidence saying Hancock suggested this. It's not in his pandemic diaries. And now you have verbal testimony at the inquiry suggesting that he wanted this lockdown, and actually the former Prime Minister, Johnson, will be given evidence next week, at which point he will, I assume, be directly asked did this phone call take place.
But here's the thing. If there is no evidence of this phone conversation taking place, what we do have is plenty of evidence of the consequences of not locking down at the beginning of March. I mean, let's not forget, Italy went into full lockdown weeks ahead of us.
Honestly, I remember seeing Italy. I remember being in the room and I remember Chris Whitty standing there, and I said, we are 2 weeks behind Italy. If we lock down in 2 weeks' time instead of now, how many people will die? He looked at me and I thought, I shouldn't, that was a bit much, Beth.
So the whole point Matt Hancock was trying to make today was, well, we had to identify the best possible time to start because we didn't know how long people would adhere to it. Of course, as it proved, the British public were massively up to the task and they did stick to it, and they stuck to it for far, far longer than Spivey or anyone else in government realised. But that doesn't detract from the point that there was plenty of evidence that suggested lockdown now and you will save lives.
No, I think, and isn't part of this politicians trying to anticipate what they think the outcome, the findings of the inquiry will be, and then you try and get onto the right side of that argument, right? If he made that phone call, where is it in the evidence?
Where does this go next, Beth? We've got Boris Johnson, I believe, next week? On the inquiry, we've got a number of other people, and this is just module 2 of a years-long inquiry.
Next week we've got Boris Johnson, and that obviously is going to be blockbuster testimony because a lot has been said about him, a lot's been said about how he's run the government. There have been many, many troubling pieces of testimony levelled about his conduct, and so kind of hearing from him, having this body of evidence, I think will be a very big moment. But ultimately, what the KC is trying to get to in this inquiry is the truth of what happened, what went wrong, what went right, what we did well, in order that you can build a plan for if this happens again. The shame of all of it, actually, what I really think, is that it's kind of descended into a exercise, a lot of it, in sort of finger pointing and name calling and blame shifting. There's a lot of heat, and at the moment there's not that much light. And I guess his job will be, once he's gathered all the evidence, he's then got to put it all together, and maybe at that point he will weave through all the different pieces of evidence and try to create a narrative.
But look, Beth, let's park COVID just for a second and deal with some. I have to say, I think quite sad news. Alistair Darling, the former Chancellor. Now, I knew him quite well because I was doing the job here in Westminster as a political correspondent up until 2010 when of course the government's changed, and spent a lot of time in and around the Treasury with him and his team. And I always found him to be a very thoughtful, very smart, quite self-deprecating. I mean, he had this. There were people who had this image of him as a bit of a grey man.
When that news broke earlier that Alistair had died, and he's only at 70,
it's terrible.
I mean, I had a sharp intake of breath. I was really stunned, and it seems so young, and he's got kids. So I feel really sad about it. So there were kind of two big elements of Alistair's late career, when he was obviously Chancellor during the financial crash and kind of steered the country through that with Gordon Brown. And then, of course, the role he played in the Scottish independence referendum. And I got to know him a bit when I was doing that. And I always found him very wry, self-deprecating, quick-witted. In politics, there's lots of people in politics, and then there's some that really float to the surface, and they just have a quality and a presence about them, and Alistair was that. He
believed in public service.
He believed in public service. He was decent. Whatever side of the political divide, people respected him.
That's true.
And I think that's what's come through in a lot of the tweets and messages that have been put out today. Yeah, and it made me. I just thought, what a loss.
I think I agree with you on that one. Beth, It's always lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us once again on the Daily Podcast. Hope it wasn't too bruising. And that is your lot for this edition of the Sky News Daily. We will be back again tomorrow.